One of the most important consequential archaeological discoveries of all time, the Dead Sea Scrolls, might be older than we initially thought, according to artificial intelligence.
A bored teenager, a flock of goats, a hot afternoon by the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a crack in a cliff just to pass the time. It didn't echo. It broke something. Inside that cave were clay jars. Inside those jars, linen-wrapped scrolls sealed for 2,000 years. No one who hid them ever expected them to be found. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most important ancient manuscripts ever discovered. After 1947, the world fought over them. Governments claimed them. Religions feared them. Forgers faked them. And most of the scrolls? Unreadable, too fragile, too faded, too damaged for human eyes. Then came AI. In the last 5 years, artificial intelligence has done what scholars couldn't. It read the unreadable, and what it found is shaking the foundations of history. It touches the Bible directly. Who wrote it? When? Whether the version we read today matches what existed 2 millennia ago. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is peer-reviewed science meeting 2,000 years of faith. Neither is walking away the same. So what exactly did they find? Let's get into it. The accident that shook the world. His name was Muhammad ed-Dib. He was 15 years old, a Bedouin shepherd boy from the Ta'amira tribe, and in early 1947, he was doing what shepherds do, tracking a stray goat along the limestone cliffs northwest of the Dead Sea. When his stone disappeared into that cave opening, he climbed in to investigate. He found ceramic jars, some of them still sealed. Inside, tightly rolled scrolls wrapped in deteriorating linen cloth. He brought them back to his camp. Within weeks, word had spread to antiquities dealers in Bethlehem. Within months, scholars in Jerusalem were holding what they suspected might be extraordinary. They were right, but even they could not have imagined just how extraordinary. Over the next decade, Bedouin treasure hunters and professional archaeologists combed the surrounding cliffs in a frantic race against each other. 11 caves in total were found to contain manuscripts. Cave 4 alone yielded more than 15,000 fragments from over 900 different scrolls. What those scrolls contained was staggering. Every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther was represented. Copies predating any previously known manuscript by 1,000 years. There were also entirely unknown texts, apocalyptic visions, hymns, legal codes, community rulebooks, commentaries, and cryptic writings that did not match anything in any existing religious tradition. The world was looking at an entire lost library, and in 1947, the world around those caves was on fire. The British mandate over Palestine was collapsing. The United Nations was debating the partition plan that would create the State of Israel. By May 1948, war had broken out. The caves sat in a no-man's land between competing claims. Scrolls ended up scattered across institutions in Jordan, Israel, the United States, and the Vatican. Documents that belonged together were separated by borders, politics, and rivalries that had nothing to do with ancient history. From the very beginning, the Dead Sea Scrolls were not just a historical discovery, they were a battleground. Decades of secrecy, scandal, and suppression. Here is something that does not get said enough. For almost 50 years after their discovery, most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were kept secret. Not by governments, not by intelligence agencies, by academics. A small team of scholars, assembled in the early 1950s and led initially by a French Dominican priest named Roland Devaux, was given exclusive rights to publish the texts. They worked very slowly. So slowly that by the 1980s, the majority of the scrolls had still not been published. They were sitting in locked rooms at the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, accessible only to those inner circle members and whoever they chose to invite. The rest of the world waited. Conspiracy theories filled the vacuum. Were the scholars suppressing texts that undermined Christianity? Were there hidden gospels locked in those rooms? Was there proof that Jesus had connections to the Qumran community? That everything the church had claimed about Christian uniqueness was built on borrowed ideas from a desert sect? The scholars denied everything and kept working slowly. Then, in 1991, the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, made a decision that detonated the entire arrangement. They had obtained a complete photographic set of the scrolls, and they published it, all of it, to any researcher who asked. The monopoly was over. The fallout was immediate and ugly. John Strugnell, who had been leading the publication team, gave an interview to an Israeli newspaper in which he made comments so inflammatory about Judaism, calling it a horrible religion that should have ceased to exist, that he was immediately removed from his position. The scandal exposed the poisonous politics that had surrounded the project from its earliest days. DeVoe, who had died in 1971, had long faced accusations that he deliberately slowed publication to prevent findings that might challenge Catholic doctrine. Whether or not that was true, the damage was done. Jewish and Christian scholars, who might have collaborated instead, regarded each other with deep suspicion for a generation. When all the texts were finally available to everyone, something unexpected happened. The conspiracy theories mostly evaporated. There were no hidden gospels. There was no proof of Jesus in the caves. What there was, instead, was something in some ways more unsettling. Evidence that ancient Judaism was far more diverse, fractured, and theologically creative than anyone had fully appreciated. The scrolls were not one community's library. They seemed to be the collected writings of an entire cultural moment, a snapshot of Jewish thought, just before everything was destroyed by Rome. But reading that snapshot fully, that remained impossible, because many of the fragments were just too damaged, until the machines arrived. The machine that reads what human eyes cannot. The problem with ancient manuscripts is not just that they are old. It is that aging is not uniform. Parchment stretches and warps, ink oxidizes and fades, fragments get crushed, burned, waterlogged, or simply disintegrate until what you have left is a puzzle with half the pieces missing and the other half smudged beyond recognition. Traditional scholarship had two tools for working with these fragments. The first was radiocarbon dating, measuring the decay of carbon-14 in the organic material to determine its age. It worked, but it required destroying small samples of irreplaceable material, and its margin of error could span decades or even centuries. The second was paleography, studying handwriting styles to place a document in a particular era. Experts would compare letter shapes, stroke angles, and spacing to other known manuscripts. It was subjective, it was imprecise, and its margins of error were even wider than radiocarbon dating. A fragment might be from 200 BCE or from 50 CE. There was no way to be certain. In 2020, a research team at the University of Groningen decided to change that. They built an artificial intelligence system trained specifically on Dead Sea Scroll fragments that had already been dated through carbon testing. The AI studied not just letter shapes, but everything. The exact angle of every individual stroke, the pressure variations across the parchment, the spacing between words, the rhythm of the scribe's hand. They named it Enoch, after the biblical figure who, according to ancient tradition, was taken to heaven and shown hidden knowledge. The name would prove appropriate. When tested against scrolls of known age, Enoch achieved dating accuracy within 30 years. That is 10 times more precise than traditional paleographic analysis. And when it was turned loose on the scrolls themselves, it immediately found things that centuries of scholarship had missed. The most dramatic early finding involved the Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the best preserved documents from Cave 1, the very cave where everything began. Scholars had studied that scroll intensively for 70 years. They believed it was the work of a single scribe. Enoch said, no, 2 scribes. The transition happens at a very specific point, detectable not by any visual marker obvious to human eyes, but by subtle shifts in letter formation that the AI could measure in ways human perception simply cannot. This finding was later confirmed by other methods. The AI was right. And if it had found something that 70 years of expert human analysis had missed on one of the most studied documents in history, what else had been missed? The discovery that broke the rules of dating. For decades, scholars had organized scroll analysis around a clean, logical framework. There were 2 main handwriting styles in the scrolls. One was called Hasmonean, associated with the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE during the reign of the Hasmonean dynasty that ruled Judea after the Maccabean revolt. The other was called Herodian, associated with the era of Herod the Great and his successors, roughly 37 BCE to 70 CE. The assumption was simple. One came before the other. Hasmonean script evolved into Herodian script over time. If you could identify which style a fragment was written in, you could narrow down its date. Enoch analyzed hundreds of fragments, and then it announced something that quietly demolished this entire framework. Both styles existed at the same time. Throughout the entire period, scribes were not following a chronological progression. They were making choices, trained in one style or the other, preferring one for certain purposes, selecting based on the nature of the document or the community commissioning it. This was not a minor academic correction. Every study that had ever used handwriting style to date a scroll, every paper, every argument, every scholarly consensus built on that foundation now had to be reassessed. Think about what that means. Researchers had spent careers building chronological frameworks for how ancient Jewish thought developed over time. Those frameworks rested in significant part on the assumption that the scroll dating was reliable, and now it was not. At the same time, other technologies were catching up. In 2022, a team at Tel Aviv University used X-ray scanning and machine learning to virtually unroll a scroll that had been physically impossible to open. The En-Gedi scroll had been discovered in 1970 in the charred ruins of an ancient synagogue, carbonized by fire into a compact, fragile lump. Any attempt to physically unroll it would have destroyed it. The AI-assisted X-ray technique peeled back the digital layers without touching the physical object. What it revealed was the opening chapters of Leviticus, and more importantly, the technique itself proved that scrolls previously considered permanently unreadable could still be accessed. The question was no longer whether the technology could read the scrolls. The question was what it would find when it did. The codes hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. This is where the story gets genuinely strange. Enoch was built to study handwriting and date manuscripts, but pattern recognition does not respect the boundaries of what you designed a tool to find. As the AI processed more and more fragments, it began detecting mathematical structures embedded in the way the text was arranged, structures that went beyond the letters themselves. The researchers initially assumed this was noise, random statistical artifacts. Old and damaged text will produce all kinds of apparent patterns if you look hard enough, and AI systems trained on human data can inherit human tendencies to see meaning where there is none. But the patterns did not go away. They appeared across scrolls written by different scribes, in different periods, on different types of parchment. They followed consistent mathematical rules, prime number progressions, structural arrangements, analogous to error-correcting codes used in modern information theory. The probability of these patterns arising by random chance was, by the researchers' calculations, vanishingly small. The academic community split immediately. Skeptics pointed to a psychological phenomenon called apophenia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data. We are, as a species, extraordinarily good at finding faces in clouds and signals in static. Perhaps, they argued, the AI had learned to do the same. Supporters of the findings pushed back with specificity. These were not vague resemblances. They were precise, measurable, reproducible. And then came the astronomical connection. Researchers comparing the mathematical structures in the scrolls to other ancient documents found striking correlations with astronomical records from the Han Dynasty in ancient China, compiled roughly contemporaneously with the scroll's composition. Specific text arrangements in the Dead Sea manuscripts appeared to encode information about celestial positions that matched what Chinese astronomers were observing from the other side of the world at the same time. This was not entirely impossible. The Qumran community used a solar calendar, notably different from mainstream Judaism's lunar calendar, suggesting serious astronomical awareness. The Book of Enoch itself, which survives in full only in Ethiopian manuscripts, contains detailed descriptions of solar and lunar movements. Astronomical knowledge in this community was already documented. But one fragment pushed further than astronomy into territory nobody was prepared for. A text described a disturbance in the sun, specific details about an extreme solar event that did not match any recorded occurrence from the ancient world. When modern astronomers examined the description, they noted that the specifics aligned with what is now called a Carrington-level event, a massive solar storm of the type that famously disrupted telegraph systems across Europe and North America in 1859 when it first entered the scientific record. Mainstream scholarship largely rejected this interpretation. Solar storms of that magnitude leave traceable signatures in tree rings and polar ice cores, and no such signature has been identified in the relevant period. The fragment was probably describing a religious vision. The apparent match with modern solar science was almost certainly coincidental. But the story had already escaped the journals. It hit social media. It spread. And with it came every conspiracy theory imaginable. Ancient advanced civilizations, extraterrestrial contact, suppressed scientific knowledge. Researchers who had spent years building careful, methodologically rigorous arguments found their work buried under an avalanche of alien theories and YouTube thumbnails. The real story was remarkable enough. It did not need embellishment, but the embellishment was coming regardless. When the Bible itself goes on trial, whatever you believe about the mathematical patterns, the AI's most consequential findings were simpler. They were about the biblical texts themselves, and they were not speculative. Consider the fragment known as 4Q-A, a portion of the Book of Daniel from Cave 4. The Book of Daniel is one of the most debated texts in biblical scholarship. It presents itself as prophecy, detailed visions of future empires and end-time events, attributed to a Jewish exile living in Babylon in the 6th century BCE. But modern scholars have long noted that its predictions grow remarkably precise up until approximately 164 BCE, the climax of the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Empire, and then become vague. This pattern strongly suggests the book was actually written during that revolt as a form of historical fiction dressed as ancient prophecy, a common genre in antiquity. Enoch analyzed the handwriting on the 4Q-Dan, a fragment. It placed the document at approximately 164 BCE, with a margin of error of 30 years, meaning this fragment might have been produced during the author's own lifetime. It might be, in some meaningful sense, close to an original. For secular scholars, this was confirmation. For believers who regarded Daniel as genuine prophecy, written 6 centuries before the events it described, the AI's dating was a challenge they could not easily dismiss. But the Ecclesiastes fragment hit harder. The book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet in Hebrew, is attributed by tradition to King Solomon, who ruled in the 10th century BCE. It is one of the most philosophically sophisticated texts in the Bible, a meditation on mortality and meaning that has consoled and disturbed readers for 3,000 years. Modern scholars had long argued, based on linguistic analysis, that Ecclesiastes was actually composed in the 3rd century BCE, that its vocabulary, grammar, and philosophical framework all reflected Hellenistic influences that could not have existed in Solomon's time. Traditional believers rejected this, insisting on Solomonic authorship. Enoch examined the Dead Sea fragment. It dated the handwriting to approximately 240 BCE, consistent with scholarly consensus, radically inconsistent with Solomon. More disturbing still, the fragment showed no signs of being a copy made from an earlier source. There were none of the typical scribal corrections, the small marks and adjustments that appear when a scribe is working from an older text they occasionally misread or struggled to interpret, which raised the uncomfortable possibility that what Enoch was looking at was not far removed from the book's original composition, a book attributed to a king who lived 700 years before the fragment was written. Beyond individual books, AI analysis also began revealing something scholars had long suspected but could not fully document: that the biblical text was not fixed in the way later tradition claimed. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve versions of biblical books that differ, sometimes in small ways, sometimes significantly, from the Masoretic text that became the standard Hebrew Bible after 70 CE. Some passages present in one version simply do not exist in another. The books were still fluid, still being shaped. The idea of a single, definitive, unchanging biblical text. The idea that what we hold in our hands today is exactly what God or the prophets originally wrote. That idea does not survive contact with the scrolls. Religious institutions responded in predictably different ways. Some scholars within faith communities embraced the findings, arguing that variation proved only that human transmission was imperfect, not that the essential message was compromised. Others argued that publicizing these variations would damage ordinary believers who were not equipped to evaluate the technical arguments. The question of who gets to decide what ordinary believers can handle, that question had been at the center of every fight over these scrolls from the beginning. The war nobody wanted, but everyone started. When the University of Groningen published Enoch's dating results in the journal PLOS One in 2023, the response was not discussion, it was war. Within weeks, a coalition of senior paleographers had published a counterpaper accusing the AI researchers of reducing centuries of accumulated scholarly expertise to algorithms that could not understand context, culture, or meaning. One of the world's most respected Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, Professor Emmanuel Tov of the Hebrew University, who had served as editor-in-chief of the official publication project for decades, expressed deep reservations about trusting machines with texts that required human judgment. The researchers fired back. The data was the data. The AI was not making interpretive choices. It was measuring, and measurement does not have a cultural bias. The battle turned personal very quickly. At the 2023 International Meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in San Antonio, a panel discussion on AI and ancient manuscripts reportedly devolved into shouting. Scholars who had worked together for 20 years stopped returning each other's emails. Academic social media, already a place known more for point scoring than dialogue, became genuinely toxic. Researchers began receiving hate mail, some from religious believers who felt their faith was being dismantled, some from conspiracy theorists who believed the researchers were suppressing evidence of ancient aliens, alternative Bibles, or secret societies. None of this was new, not really. The scrolls had been a battleground for decades before the machines arrived. The 1991 Huntington Library breach had caused explosions of its own. The Strugnell scandal had left wounds that never fully healed. The institutional Catholic Church, burned by the slow publication controversy, had maintained careful public silence ever since, while privately funding its own research programs to monitor developments before they required a response. And then came the forgeries. In 2017 and 2018, a German researcher named Kip Davis, working with a team of scientists using multispectral imaging and forensic chemistry, proved that 16 fragments owned by the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. were modern fakes. The museum, a $500 million facility funded by the evangelical Green family who own Hobby Lobby, had purchased these fragments for millions of dollars as evidence of biblical authenticity. The forgers had used genuine ancient parchment, probably scraped clean of its original text, and written convincing Hebrew in ink formulated to mimic ancient chemistry. Some fragments had been artificially aged with organic compounds. The forgeries had passed inspection by multiple experts over many years. The museum announced the findings itself. It was an extraordinary act of institutional honesty that did little to contain the devastation. Because the Museum of the Bible was not alone. Scholars now estimate that as many as 70 fake Dead Sea Scroll fragments entered the antiquities market after 2002. Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Azusa Pacific University, Trinity International University, and other institutions had all purchased what they believed were genuine ancient manuscripts. They had been paying between $100,000 and $1 million per fragment. They were all fakes. The forgery crisis raised a question that cut to the heart of the entire enterprise. If expert human analysis could be fooled by well-made forgeries for over a decade, how reliable was any of the scholarship built on that analysis? And if AI could detect forgeries that human eyes could not, what did that say about the relationship between human expertise and machine capability? The financial stakes made everything worse. Antiquities dealers who had sold fragments at enormous prices faced the possibility that their inventory would be systematically exposed. Some welcomed AI authentication as a way to restore market confidence. Others quietly began lobbying against mandatory AI analysis, arguing that forced testing violated the property rights of collectors. A Republican congressman from Texas introduced a bill that would have restricted federal funding for AI analysis of religious artifacts. The bill died in committee, but it demonstrated that this was no longer purely a scholarly dispute. It had become a political fight, with millions of dollars on one side and the authority to define history on the other. And in 2024, just as the dust from one controversy began to settle, the AI produced another finding. Researchers announced that Enoch had identified previously unknown textual connections between the Community Rule Scroll, one of the foundational documents from Qumran, and specific passages in the Gospel of Matthew. The connections suggested that early Christian writers may have had direct access to Qumran literature, that the movement Jesus launched was not emerging in isolation from the Judaism of its time, but may have been in direct dialogue with some of its most radical strands. Professor John Collins of Yale Divinity School called it potentially revolutionary for understanding Christian origins. Conservative Christian scholars immediately pushed back, calling the connections coincidental. The debate was now not just about Judaism in antiquity, it was about Christianity, about where it came from, about whether the religion that shaped Western civilization had roots more tangled and more human than tradition had acknowledged. The scrolls, patient as stone, kept giving. What comes next, and why it changes everything? Here is what we actually know. Artificial intelligence has given us tools to read the Dead Sea Scrolls with a precision that was simply not possible before. It has corrected errors in dating that had been foundational to an entire field. It has found things, patterns, connections, textual variations that decades of brilliant human scholarship had not detected. It has also generated controversy that sometimes obscures more than it reveals, attracting sensationalists who want ancient aliens and conspiracy theorists who want suppressed gospels, when the real findings are strange and significant enough on their own terms. The question the scrolls are forcing us to confront now is not just historical, it is philosophical. We have always assumed that knowledge, particularly knowledge about sacred texts, about the deep past, about the foundations of civilization, required human interpretation. The scholar was not just a reader, the scholar was a judge. Their training, their cultural context, their accumulated intuition, these were the filters through which ancient documents became understood. Now, a machine processes more data in 1 hour than a scholar could analyze in a lifetime. It finds patterns invisible to human perception, and it cannot fully explain its reasoning in terms that traditional paleographers recognize. When Enoch says a scroll was copied around 165 BCE, it cannot articulate the why in the language of scholarship. It can produce the statistical confidence interval. It cannot produce the argument. That is a problem, and not a small one. The scholars who resist AI analysis are not simply being territorial, though some of them certainly are. Their deeper concern is about what gets lost when you reduce human artifacts to data points. A scribe who copied scripture in antiquity was not just producing information. He was engaged in an act loaded with meaning. Religious, communal, personal. Can an algorithm understand that? Should it matter if it cannot? If the measurements it produces are accurate? We do not have a clean answer to that question yet. What we have instead is an argument, loud, sometimes ugly, sometimes productive, between people who represent different ideas about what knowledge is and who gets to produce it. Meanwhile, the fragments keep arriving. More caves may still hold undiscovered material. Scholars estimate that only a fraction of what was originally hidden in the Judean wilderness has been found. The Israel Antiquities Authority announced in 2021 that a new excavation of previously unexplored caves had yielded dozens of additional fragments, the first new material in 60 years. Some of those fragments remain unanalyzed, and the technology keeps improving. Systems more powerful than Enoch are already in development. Virtual unwrapping techniques that worked on the Engedi scroll are now being applied to other damaged documents. Multispectral imaging is revealing text in fragments that appeared completely blank to the naked eye. We are at the very beginning of what AI can do with ancient texts. We are not at the end. What that means for faith is a question each person has to answer for themselves. The scrolls do not disprove religion. They do not confirm it. What they do is make the story more complicated, more human, more contested, more alive. They show us a world in which the texts we now regard as sacred were being written, debated, revised, hidden, and argued over by real people with specific beliefs and specific fears. Those people did not know they were writing scripture. They were just writing, doing what people have always done, trying to make sense of the world, trying to preserve something worth remembering, trying to speak across time to whoever might eventually be listening. 2,000 years later, we are finally able to hear them more clearly, and what they are saying is more complicated and more interesting than the silence that came before. The scrolls are not finished speaking, the machines are not finished listening, and the argument about what it all means, that argument has only just begun.